I'll go ahead and get started. Ethics is a very big topic, at least for me, when considering human subject research. So hopefully you can see the screens now. So talking about some of the timelines, I think the most famous one is probably the Tuskegee syphilis study that was started in 1932 and actually lasted until 1972. Seeing as I graduated high school in 1976, when I first read this study, I was really surprised to think that this type of study was still ongoing while I was in school. I had hoped that something like this was not ongoing. With the Tuskegee, this was a study where the Public Health Service was looking at syphilis, and they actually enrolled approximately 600 African-American males, about 400 that actually had latent syphilis, and 200 were used as controls. Subjects were told that they were being treated for their bad blood, and despite syphilis penicillin coming out in the 1940s, they were not treated with the penicillin. So the study lasted until 72, while these individuals were not told of a cure or a treatment for the syphilis. Some of their wives and even some of their children ended up dying from the syphilis because they were not treated. And we'll talk about some of the case studies that we talk about with Nuremberg and Helsinki and Belmont. To me, that this went on until the 70s is just unbelievable. When I first saw 1932, again, I thought, oh, this is an older study. But the fact that in 72, it was finally stopped, and this was because of a leak to the press, to me just seems unconscionable. In the 1930s, we had the German concentration camps. Again, these were some very horrendous studies that were performed on those in the concentration camps, including children. I had the opportunity to listen to one of the twins present at an ACRP conference several years ago, and listening to the things that were done to the children, again, is horrendous. Holmesburg Prison, this was as late as the 1950s. This was for non-therapeutic studies. These are things where, if you've ever read the book, Acres of Skin, this talks about the Holmesburg Prison studies, where this was all for cosmetic. So they would apply creams or different perfumes and things like this to the men. What I really took away from that was the fact that all of the men did sign consent. So it's not that they were not asked to participate in the studies, as was during the concentration camps. But in this case, at that time in the prison systems, inmates had to find a way to earn money in order to buy things, because these things were not provided by the government, such as clothing or food or toothbrushes or razors. They depended on their loved ones outside the system in supplying this. So when the investigator came and started, he made the comment, acres of skin for him to test on. The person was Albert Kligman. He came from the Pennsylvania University. And these, again, were all non-therapeutic medical studies. At least they started off that way. Government found out that he was doing these studies in the prisons. And later on, he was also doing testing with LSD, radium, and all sorts of things. What the one observer saw is that when he walked into the prison was all of these men with just all sorts of skin missing and patches on their skin, but this was the only way for them to earn money. So again, questions about how the consent was carried out. One of the next things was the Willowbrook study. This was a pediatric study whereby a hospital for mentally retarded children were housed. The investigator decided that he could test hepatitis C. This was a disease that was very rampant in the home, but he actually would go and actually give the children the hepatitis C in order to see how it progressed and test treatments. Again, these were children that were at the mercy of the institution. Many of the parents signed their rights over on their children in order to find a place to house them. So again, questions on consent. And then the final one I want to kind of mention was Jesse Gelsinger. You see his picture right up here in the middle. He was a college kid who volunteered to be in a research study. He had a genetic disease of which I'm not going to try to pronounce, of the liver, and volunteered for one of the first gene therapy studies. During that, he was given the gene therapy and ended up passing away. There is a lot of documentation. University of Pennsylvania was examined after that, and they had to report out as to what they had done. There was conflict of interest on the part of the investigator. Things were not disclosed in the consent, primarily the death of animals during some of the pre-studies. All of this information was not given. So one of the things I'd like to do today is to maybe discuss first, what are some of our most historic documents that we use to guide our clinical research. Of course, Nuremberg from 1947. I'm not going to spend a lot of details on some of these. Nuremberg Code is one that you should know. It came out of the Nazi trials, and here they were trying to put some guidance around how human subject research subjects should be cared for, so that there had to be voluntary consent. None of the Nazi prisoners were given consent. That the study should benefit society. Many of the studies that were completed during Nuremberg really were of no benefit to anybody, but were really just cruel. None of them were based on animal experiments. We should minimize risks. Those risks were not considered with any of these subjects. There was lots of infections and it was never treated. And that a volunteer can voluntarily end an experiment. And again, we don't even use the word experiment anymore. And that the studies be performed by trained and qualified people. The next one was the Declaration of Helsinki several years later. This was more looking at how researchers should behave, that they should conform to the accepted principles. There should be a formulated protocol that has been reviewed, that the benefits and the risks should be equal, or at least the benefits should outweigh the risks, and that if there was some type of risks involved, that we should be placing safeguards in place. And these were some of the things that were also discussed in Helsinki. Most of you are probably aware of the Belmont report, which we use probably more right now, which actually kind of pulled everything together of the Helsinki and the Nuremberg documents, and saying that when doing human subject research, these are the guiding values. And this speaks more to the ethics, that anything that we would do with human subject research would have respect of persons, the autonomy, that they have the right to say yes, they have the right to say no, and that if they are the vulnerable populations, such as the prisoners, such as the children in institutional homes, that there was someone who would be looking out for their best interest. And as we saw in Willowbrook and also in the Holmesburg studies, this was not performed. Benefits, to do no harm. And again, this goes back to maximizing the benefits and minimizing the risks. The study should not be one where the risks are so heavy that it threatens life or permanent damage, and that this is not charity, but an obligation. This is something that you see more in some of the international studies of, if you take a science to another country just because it's cheaper, but then you don't leave that information with them. It's an obligation to see that the individuals are well taken care of. And then justice talks about the fair distribution, that the risks are the same to all, the benefits are the same to all, that some subjects are not picked over others. You may have heard the word cherry picking at some time, and that every subject is treated the same. This comes to thought when looking at incentives. Are some being paid more than others? All of them need to be treated fairly. There was an article out back in 2000 from JAMA in which some ethicists got together and came up with 7 points for what makes human subject research ethical. And these are also some guiding ethical principles that is used in evaluating human subject research. Social or scientific value, that has to show that this is a value to the society as a whole. Just doing research in order to get funding obviously is not a valid reason to do the research, but that it to show something, a show of value. Scientific validity. We'll discuss this here in a little bit about some of the studies, but making sure that you're basing this on scientific facts, which comes into conflict when we talk about misconduct. Fair subject selection. Again, are you cherry picking? Are you only picking the ones that you think will respond the way that you want? Is there disparities involved? This is something that is very upfront in our culture right now. Are you only picking those that have good health care in order to push the results that you want? Favorable risk benefit ratio. Again, this is something, especially in pediatrics trials, where I started out, of making sure that whatever risks that you're putting those children through, that there is some benefit, that either to society as a whole or maybe to those individuals. And yes, sometimes studies are beneficial to the subjects. Independent review. I think this is so important. Independent review is also very important when you talk about auditing and compliance, that someone outside of the study who does not have interest in how the study outcomes per se, proving their hypothesis is correct, that someone is independently reviewing the study before it starts, during the study, and after the study, to make sure that the human subjects are being treated fairly the way that they should, and that the science is being conducted correctly. Informed consent. Of course, that is probably one of the biggest topics that is always forefront. How is that informed consent process conducted? And most especially now, we have a lot of the more e-consents. Are we making sure that our subjects are truly informed? Simply handing a consent to a subject and saying, here, this is what we're going to do, and then making them sign is obviously not something that we can do. We want to make sure that they understand. And a lot of this requires us to have them verbalize something back to us. Do they understand what procedures are going to take place? If those procedures have some type of risk associated to them, do they understand what those risks are? And more importantly, during informed consent, you want to make sure that they understand the difference between standard of care and clinical research, the values behind those. In standard of care, it is the patient's well-being that is uppermost, whereas in clinical research, there may not be a benefit to the patient. And so making sure that they understand what is clinical care and what is research is very important in informed consent. And then respect for the potential and enrolled subjects, treating everyone with respect and to listen to them. I think that as coordinators, that is one of our biggest responsibilities, is to listen to our patients, understand what they're going through, understand that they are volunteers. They are not necessarily obligated to do the research. And this is true even for cancer trials. And the reason I say that is I've had both parents pass away from cancer, as well as my father-in-law. And all of them had the opportunity to participate in a research trial, but they also had the opportunity to say no, that they didn't wish to go through that. And I think that recognizing the fact that sometimes participants may not wish to participate, or they may start off participating and then the rigors of chemotherapies or whatever the treatment may be is too hard, because it is very difficult to manage all the side effects of some of the chemo. So if you have not seen or read this paper, I would highly suggest that you do so, because, and I do at the end have the listing so that you can find it. So some of the ethical challenges today. Obviously, we're not in a wartime like World War I or World War II. But one of the things that we have that we are facing now that present a lot of ethical dilemmas is gene modification. So in November of 2018, there was a report about the first gene-edited babies. This was out of China. There was a Chinese investigator who had edited the embryos of a set of twin girls to prevent them from being susceptible to HIV or AIDS. Again, there were a lot of questions about whether or not the parents knew the embryos were being modified. There's question about whether the consent was valid. So, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. Use of placebos. There's a lot of questions about that, whether the procedures are without benefits, if they're going through all of the procedures, but yet they're receiving a sugar pill, so to speak. And there's also the psychobiological effect of what they call the placebo effect. Post-trial responsibilities, incidental findings, continued access to medication, and international studies bring this up a lot. Competing protocols for the same patient populations. This sometimes when you have rare diseases, or most recently even for COVID, how many protocols did an institution have trying to seek the same population? Medical misconduct. I've done a lot of research in this area. Withholding approved treatments such as Tuskegee, data falsification or fabrication, and then also conflicts of interest, as in Jesse Gelsinger's case. And then access to medical data and specimens. Who has the right to use this? We are collecting so much data in our electronic medical records. Who has the right to use that? And I'm not just talking about that information which is collected during a clinical trial, but this is also some of the data that is collected during hospitalizations. All of that big data, who has the right to access it if it is de-identified, and who determines how it's de-identified, and is it properly de-identified? So talking about gene editing. So Janku was the physician who genetically altered the embryos of the twins, hoping to rewrite the gene pool for future generations. He was brought up on trial and was found guilty of misconduct. But this sent a ripple through the research environment as to whether or not this was something that the world as a whole wanted to start looking at, is making these genetic modifications. However, in May of 2019, we had gene therapy, which is part of a replacements or skipping for life-saving treatments of pediatric disease. So SMA1 is a disease that affects infants, and usually if they are diagnosed with SMA1, they usually expire prior to their second or third birthday. So where is the conflict here? Do we mess with the genes? Do we leave them alone? How far is too far? These are questions that we as a research environment need to make. Honestly, The SMA1 treatment, I was very happy about. When I first started in clinicals, I worked in neurology, and I saw some of these children and watched them pass away, and it was very difficult. But at the same time, to start being able to pick and choose what we want for our babies and modifying those embryos, I'm not so sure that that is something we should be doing as well. So I leave this to you. Do you believe that doing the gene editing and the modifications is something we should ethically be getting into? And you'll find that today there are no hard answers. This is all, and that's what ethics is about, is considering each case. Okay, so for the use of placebos, this is the standard to take and measure a medication against a placebo. Is there an effect? Does it do what we want it to do? And things like that. But sometimes you get a false positive. If the individual feels that they are getting the true drug, sometimes they can say, yes, I feel better. Yes, it does help. They see that a lot in some of the antidepressant studies. Just the thought that you're getting something that is to make you feel better. You feel better, but you're not getting anything. So those are things that have to be taken into effect. Again, that's why I think if you use the biological specimens to measure things and look at your biomarkers, the placebos can work sometimes. In the Tuskegee syphilis study, again, you had where they were using a placebo. These individuals who had the quote bad blood felt that they were receiving treatment and that this would make them better. And they went through procedures of blood draws and everything else for nothing. That you have a performance of procedures without any benefit. There are growth hormone studies where children or adults were in a study and they would have injections, daily injections of the growth hormone. Only there was a control group who did daily injections of that had no benefit whatsoever. So again, continual invasive procedure without benefit. And then, of course, there are consent issues. If some of them are being placed on placebo, do you tell the individuals, or is this something that is not divulged at time of consent? I think nowadays we feel that that is something that they need to know about, but in the past there were times when this was not disclosed to the individuals during consent. So here we have a scenario that was presented to the NIH Bioethics Core to do an evaluation. A researcher is conducting clinical trials with depressed children and adolescents. One of the difficulties is that new drugs for the treatment of adult depression quickly become used for off-label treatment of pediatric patients without solid empirical evidence. His new study involves comparing a new antidepressant drug to a standard drug and to a placebo. All subjects are followed for suicidal ideation and withdrawn from the study if suicidal potential is evident. He argues a placebo control is required in order to answer the scientific question about the efficacy of the new drug. So using adult medications on pediatric patients off-label is was a very prominent practice, at least when I started in clinics 20 years ago. But thankfully, we've had regulations passed that require pediatric trials also on treatments. So here you have, and we have history of adult depression antidepressants having the reverse effect on the pediatric populations. So this was a study or a question that was posed to the NIH Bioethics Committee to weigh in on simply because the local IRB was split in their decision as to whether to do it or not. What would you have done? Would you approve the study or would you not approve the study? Makes you question. Post-trial responsibilities. So this is another one. You've heard about incidental findings. So these are findings that in the course of a study come up, and do you divulge it to the patient? You do an MRI scan for something and you find something. Do you divulge it to the patient? which of course, yes, you do. But there's questions as to at what point do you tell them? Um, do you tell them? Is this something that they would want to know? This is especially important when you're talking about genetic studies. So would they want to know if there is a propensity for that type of disease? One of my earlier studies was looking at the occurrence of type 1 diabetes in children. And so there was a study where we were looking at the biomarkers in siblings of a type 1 diabetic child to see if they might be at risk for also acquiring type 1 diabetes at some point. And most parents, after experiencing one child with the type 1 diabetes, they were anxious to find out whether or not the other children might be at risk. But there were also some parents who, in particular, said, no, I don't want to know ahead of time because then I'll just worry too much. And so it is something that sometimes they don't want to know what's coming because, again, this is research and it's not 100% accurate at all times. So this is something to consider when designing a trial of perhaps they do or perhaps they don't wish to know what those incidental findings are, and also then to what extent, what are our responsibilities there. International studies really present this problem a lot. Pharmaceutical companies will go to third world countries to conduct their research because it is a lot less expensive to do so. But at the same time, it is not fair if they do research in these countries for things that would be of no benefit to those individuals later on. So to do some type of trial that has nothing to do with their country. And then also, you also have the post-trial responsibility of if you go to a third world country and look at treatment for, say, yellow fever or something, Ebola, do you then also make this available to them after the study is over? This is also important when enrolling international patients. So a patient that may come from overseas to go into a trial, but that in order to keep treating the individual or the child, they can't go home because the medication will not be available in their home countries. How do you handle that? So when designing your trials, you need to look at not just what you're going to do during the trial, but what is going to happen to the subjects afterwards. If this was something that they needed to get every day in order for it to work, are they still going to be able to get that drug afterwards? Again, these are things that need to be considered at the time that the studies are being designed. How will these things be handled? And to be thinking about those questions before you even start the trial. So here's another question that was posed to the NIH bioethics. A 50-year-old man enrolled in a study of pulmonary fibrosis was informed that he had a hereditary form of the disease, and thus his children were at increased risk. The man had given up his daughter for adoption when she was an infant, and as an adult, she requested that he not contact her again. He is unsure whether or how to communicate with her about her risk of developing the disease and the possible influence of certain behaviors, such as smoking. So again, this is an incidental finding. They obviously did a genetic profile looking. He's informed that his children are at increased risk. So does he inform his children, even if they've been placed in adoption, does he go through that process to let someone know? There was a lot of concern with the BRCA gene for breast cancer, that if women with breast cancer were diagnosed as having that gene, it meant that their offsprings were at a higher risk. Again, is that something that your daughters or sons would want to know about? Or is that just going to make them more anxious? You saw in the news, if you saw of Angelina Jolie who found out that she was positive for the gene and had a double mastectomy so that she wouldn't have to worry about it. Is that the right thing? Or sometimes not knowing is better. It makes you question, what do you do with some of those incidental findings? Because sometimes people don't want to know, and we have to respect their right not to know as much as their right to know. So it does place an ethical dilemma on the investigators as to how they're going to handle these things. One of the things that we've seen recently is the competing protocols. One of my colleagues was talking about the COVID trials and said that a patient had made the comment while they were being treated for COVID that they felt like they were in a used car lot being approached by the sales staff all at once, be in this study, be in that study. And I think that those are things during a pandemic or even an epidemic that we need to be aware of when approaching the patients, that we do not inundate them and make them feel like an animal in a maze. And then also, you also have the rare diseases where you have extremely small populations. I saw this a lot in the pediatric trials, where in a given institution, you may only have 2 or 3. And that's where you end up doing the multi-center trials, trying to get those populations numbers in order to have a valid study. How do you handle that? Who handles that? I would think that, IRBs need to be cognizant of those types of things. But if you look at the big centers now, like cardiovascular, they have large populations, but which study is more important, that you would keep hitting them with all of these different studies? So these are things that you would need to look at and consider. So one of the trials that I participated in was an obesity study in adolescents. And we ended up with the basic trial, which was looking at biomarkers after bariatric surgery, but there was also one of psychology, looking at what their views were. Then there was another study looking at what they ate and their nutrition. And in the end, we ended up having like 3 different protocols, all for the same study. And that gets hard on a patient. It makes it very difficult for them to be able to understand what all these different aspects are, the different arms. So we need to consider those things when designing our protocols. And then medical misconduct. This one I could probably go on forever. So I've pulled out a couple. If you go to the ORI, the Office of Responsible HHS, they have a lot of the medical misconduct letters that are written. This one was from 2019, and I've highlighted the one thing. This was an investigator who was charged with misconduct, had a lot of papers. I think he had almost 4 papers that had to be recalled. But the thing that struck me, and I guess in talking to coordinators, was he instructed his staff to change, omit, or ignore assessments. And I thought about that so many times we think of misconduct as an investigator falsifying things. But in this case, he also instructed his staff to. As coordinators, we are the last voice that those patients deal with. An investigator is interested in the outcomes of his study. He wants to prove his point or whatever the emphasis may be. But we are there to also see to the protection of the patients and making sure that they understand, that making sure that the data is correct and is complete, so that what they do for the study is not in vain. Other things was failure to document screening tests. Did they perform the requisite pregnancy tests if giving medication and things like that, blood alcohol levels? So he ended up with 4 recalled papers and had to have his research suspended for 2 years as a result of this misconduct. The second one was way back in 2001, and this was actually a clinical research coordinator who falsified his job application, and during the course of it performed mail fraud where he would submit false documents regarding the patient and the study subjects and enroll them when they didn't meet qualifications, to the extent that on one subject he falsified the blood results so that the blood chemistry analysis, so they would be enrolled into the study. However, what he didn't realize is that those blood results indicated that there was an impaired kidney and liver functions, and within about 2 weeks after they were given the medication, they passed away. This individual was given 71 months or almost 6 years of jail time and fined $639,000 in retributions to the pharmaceutical companies that he had stolen from. So again, when I came into clinical research, I was under the impression that these things don't happen anymore. But more and more we see that this does happen every day. And it's our responsibility as part of the research society and culture that we speak up and say something. In this one, an IRB and research integrity officer learned after a study is completed that the part of the grant application was plagiarized. The study had significant findings that may be important to clinicians. So do you publicize if it was plagiarized? You know, what happens to the research that is based on papers that are recalled? That is probably one of the biggest issues that we have nowadays as papers are explored and we are having more transparency with research studies and results and outcomes, is if information is falsified to gain further studies or further funding, what happens if they have a landmark case but it's all false? And we have some very prominent investigators that are brought up on charges of fabrication of their research. It wasn't so long ago that I read an article where it was the technician was falsifying the test results. And when asked why, her statement was, well, I knew what the investigator wanted, so I made sure they were kept happy because they would discuss what they were hoping to find. And there again, how do you handle something like that? Actually, the investigators were the ultimate responsible party, so they should have been watching over that. And then one of the last ones is data usage. Who has my data now? Big data is huge right now. We compile multiple tons of medical data daily. ACRP recently presented a seminar where they want to use this data of how patients respond to different treatments and put it into a computer and use it to predict outcomes and information like that. But there again, who's being responsible for this data? Artificial intelligence, predictive medicine, privacy issues, data hacks. All of this is all issues around our data. Also, the use of biobank specimens. It wasn't so long ago that if samples were taken during routine care and a test was performed and there was leftover, that then those leftovers could be used without the knowledge of the patient. So again, we don't have that as much anymore. I think that we are monitoring that more. But again, it can happen and it does happen. One of the big cases, and if you have never read about Henrietta Lacks, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, you really do need to read the book. This is a case where her cell line genetic information was taken from her without her knowledge. Others found that they could finally replicate it and make it grow. And so these were cells then that were distributed amongst the research community of, oh, we have ones that will reproduce themselves. And all of this research and patents and everything else were devised around these cell lines without benefit to the individual. And so this was one of those things that, again, you have to just look at it and say, who was right? Should she have benefited? She at least should have known about it. And there was a lot of miscommunication to the family who was health illiterate as far as what it meant by the cell line being alive, to the point that they thought that someone had secreted their loved one away and that they were alive somewhere. So again, there's a lot that goes into our research, more than just what you see on the top. And then also on data is how are the statistical analysis conducted? Is there a bias? Is your information already skewed because of the way that it was collected? And then again, if it's me, I can do a statistical analysis and come out with 3 different answers. So do you have qualified individuals looking at this? I know that the NIH is very interested in also seeing statistical applications as far as how are you going to run your statistics? How are you going to handle your data? And this is a really big interest. More and more we see data. I think sometimes we see data more than we actually see the individual. But we need to make sure that we realize that behind every data point, there is an individual that has voluntarily committed their time to giving you their information, their biological specimens, and their time in order for us to proceed with creating these and developing these new novel ways of doing things. So hopefully today I've made you think about some things. I have included some of the references. The first one, what makes clinical research ethical. I really do believe that if you have not read it, you should. It really does speak to how we make research ethical. The other thing that I would really like to point out is the research clinic, which is put out by the HHS also. This is a web link, and I'll be sending these slides to everybody this afternoon. But you can go on here if you haven't done it yet, and there is a video that you play and you take different roles. So you can be the role of the investigator, you can be the role of the coordinator, and you can be the role of an IRB official. So if you haven't had the opportunity, if you're sitting at home, working from home with some spare time, I would highly encourage you to go through this and pick 1 or 2 different scenarios and see how ethics plays out in the integrity of research. And then finally, Theodore Roosevelt. Knowing what's right doesn't mean much unless you do what's right. And I think that that is so important in what we do from day to day. Research is constantly in motion, and it has to be flexible around our patients. But at the end of the day, make sure that you've always kept the good of the patient in mind, and that if you are concerned about something, speak up. Even if it's wrong, even if what you're assuming or what you see is not exactly that, ask for the information, ask for an explanation. Why are we doing it that way? Speak for your patient. So many times our patients or subjects are afraid to speak up because they're afraid that if they do, perhaps they won't receive the care. Hopefully that isn't the case. If you have any questions, please feel free to share and to ask.